I have my notebook. I hope that everyone else has their notebook ready to take down some of your brilliant insights. But as always, at Set C, we always begin all things by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all of those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all of the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. My name is Jaleesa Brown. I am the founder of Funding Impact, where we're focused on supporting BIPOC entrepreneurs with investment readiness. And again, I'm so excited to dive into this meaningful conversation around community wealth building, which came up a little bit on our last panel. Um, Shout out to everybody that was listening to that panel. But today, let's start our talk by getting to know our panelists a little bit. So, panelists, I would love for you all to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us about your remarkable work, starting with Dr. Audrey Jamal.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay, Jaleesa?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, nice to see you all. I'm just enjoying watching all the names popping up and seeing some colleagues that I haven't chatted with in a while. So, great to be here with all of you. My name is Audrey Jamal, and I guess by way of introduction, I'll share that I'm an urban planner by training, but I'm really interested in urban economies. So, I came to the area of community wealth building from that perspective of how do you build places that are more sustainable and more equitable with those principles. So. I'm lucky enough to work at the University of Guelph. I'm a professor in the management department, and I'm also an assistant dean. And because we're an accredited business school, part of our accreditation is actually around advancing our mission, which is business as a force for good. So a lot of my work is around community partnerships and societal impact. And just one last thing before I turn it back over to you, I recently became a fellow with Social Capital Partners, and that's been a great expansion of my network as both a practitioner and an academic. So really happy to be here with all of you.
Brilliant. Sounds like amazing conversations are going to be coming out today. I would love to say hello next to Kristen. Hey, Kristen. So nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you. My name is Kristen Richard. I'm a proud member of the Red River Métis Nation, originally from Treaty 1 territory, and now I'm joining where I live and work on the traditional territory of the Sechelt Nation on the beautiful Sunshine Coast of BC. I'm the Impact Fund Manager at Entrepreneurth, which is a national nonprofit that's dedicated to empowering Northern Indigenous entrepreneurs to be drivers of social and economic change in their communities. At Entrepreneurth, we believe that Indigenous entrepreneurs can be catalysts of prosperity and drivers of social change within their communities, and that the development of sustainable enterprises can create local economic opportunities to help break through poverty, address social challenges, and strengthen Northern ways of life. My work specifically at Entrepreneurth focuses on building a $10 million impact fund. And I really think that this fund isn't just about money, it's really about shifting power and providing capital that's equitable, relational, and non-extractive to Northern Indigenous entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kristen. Next, let's say hello to Louise Edgar.
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to talk to this. Congratulations on this amazing forum. A lot of value that is being actually transferred to the different participants. So my name is Edgar Jean-François. I'm a CPA. I'm also the CEO of Groupe 3737. Groupe 3737 is an ecosystem of support for people from a diverse background. We focus on supporting entrepreneurs from a diverse background to be able to create wealth, create jobs, create resources, and work towards directing some of those resources to have a social impact. So our ultimate goal is really to have a social impact. We have now 11 offices across Canada, so we provide services to different cities across the country. The intention is really to work towards addressing issues of access to capital, access to network, access to resources. On that front, we've worked with different organizations across the country and as well with different Black leaders to create different funds to be able to support in concrete resources the Black community of Canada. It's close to $900 million towards different initiatives that has been put together collectively to be able to create and address the issues that I mentioned earlier. I have another hat. I'm also a co-founder of the FACE Coalition, which is an organization that actually delivers loans to Black entrepreneurs across Canada. Another hat that I have, I'm also the board chair of the East of Montreal Chamber of Commerce. So again, on the economic side, for us, it's really important to kind of come to a point where we dynamize the economics to be able to create resources and again to reinvest in the community. Again, it's a privilege for me to be here and looking forward for the discussions.
Thank you so much. So glad to meet you today and really excited to hear more about the initiatives happening deep in the community. Next, let's say hello to you, Shadi.
Hi everyone, good morning or good afternoon or no, good, I don't know, what do you call this? Early, late morning, early afternoon. My name is Shadi Hafez. I'm calling from my ancestral territory, otherwise known as Ottawa. I'm a member of Kiligan-Zibi and Anishinaabe, which is Algonquin community just north of Ottawa, from through my mother. My father is a first-gen migrant from Damascus, Syria. That's my background. My professionally, I'm the policy and research manager to the National Association of Friendship Centers. We support and administer funding, national funding to over 100 friendship centers across the country, which are urban indigenous civil society organizations. They provide full wraparound services and programming to indigenous people living in urban areas across the country, small towns, small cities as well. I'm also a research fellow with the Yellowhead Institute, supporting them with critical Indigenous thought and policy work. And I've done some work, business consulting for my First Nation, helping supported small business owners and developing their business ideas, accessing granting for their business opportunities, and just supporting them along the way with that. So that's me and Miigwech, and look forward to this conversation.
Wonderful. Glad to have you, Shadi. Last but not least, let's say hello to MJ.
Hi, Jalissa. Hey, everyone. Thank you, Jalissa, Victor, and team for putting this together and for the opportunity. Uh, I'm Sinha. I am a settler in Canada for the last 13 years. My background started in, funnily enough, in oil and gas risk management, and then I have run divestment portfolios. So for the last decade or so, I've been working mainly managing assets for private foundations or governments. Currently, I am the Chief Investment Officer for the Rental Protection Fund in British Columbia, which is a $500 million investment vehicle sponsored by the BC government to help finance acquisition of affordable housing across BC. So over there, I lead the investment finance and ops teams. And aside that, I see a lot of known faces. So I just like to make disclosure. I sit on the board of Definity Insurance Foundation, Philanthropic Foundations Canada, Makeway, as well as Tapestry Capital, and on the Impact Investment Committee for Laidlaw. So I wear a few hats. Yeah, but my background for the last decade has been mainly on the foundation side and now running the fund in BC. And good to meet all the fellow panelists, get to see a lot of known faces, and look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. I love how there's just so much diversity and experience that is brought to this panel. And so let's dive in with the first question, and that is, what are the key strategies for empowering underrepresented groups in Canada to participate in wealth building opportunities? Let's hear from you first, Louise.
Well, thank you. I think in the last few years, what has worked efficiently is, we had used an ecosystemic approach. I always say we don't have the pretension of doing the work that we do all by ourselves. It's important to work with different entities, whether they're coming from the public, whether the private, academic, community sectors. At the end of the day, the ecosystemic approach brings it to a point where we're able to utilize actually the different expertise. And we're currently in a context where innovation is key. The intention with the ecosystemic approach is really to utilize actually all these expertise to come to a point when we bring new ideas to kind of work towards creating an economic impact. And again, that's what worked diligently in the last 5 years. When we talk about the Black community, utilizing that approach, we've been able, through the different initiatives that we've put together in the last 5 years, to create more than 7,000 jobs. We've been able to generate more than $420 million of revenues. We've been able to, attribute funding up to $70 million to Black entrepreneurs across Canada. And those resources and the impact that it has shown wouldn't have been possible without the work of all the different sectors that I mentioned earlier. So, in order to be able to empower underrepresented group, it's important to kind of bring different expertise, different actually talents in an inclusive way around the table to make sure that we utilize actually all the talent and expertise necessary to be able to empower these underrepresenting group. And at the end of the day, by empowering these groups, what we're able to do is to be able to kind of bring talents from these actually groups and make sure that at the end of the day, we're able to inspire others to follow in this footstep. So again, just to come back, the ecosystemic approach in the last few years has been working diligently and efficiently to be able to attain that objective.
Yeah, we're certainly stronger together. So I love to hear that. Thanks for sharing. Kristen, wondering what some of the key strategies that you believe are important here.
Yeah, for sure. I like this question. I'll start by saying uh, Hereditary Chief Leanne Joe from the Squamish Nation will say that it's not about if Indigenous people will be rich, it's about when. And we need to ensure that we're holding our wealth in a good way. So I really believe that wealth building for Indigenous people starts with Indigenous-led solutions. And that is not about taking traditional Western financial models and slapping the word 7 generations on it and calling it Indigenous. That's not transformation, that's just repackaging. So it's really about for Indigenous by Indigenous. And then beyond that, I think that we really need to redefine wealth in ways that align with our worldview. Um, Wealth isn't just about money in the bank, it's community well-being, land stewardship, ceremony, storytelling, and our traditional language. It's knowing that the work that we do today will benefit future generations, not just in financial terms, but cultural and spiritual wealth as well. And I think to do this, we really need to challenge the status quo. The financial systems in Canada were not built for Indigenous people. They were actually built to exclude us. And that's why we're seeing now starting to become more Indigenous-led funds, more community-driven investment models, and more people reclaiming their economic power. And I think that there's a lot of amazing businesses and organizations doing this type of work across Canada, many across the north that are doing extraordinary work to incorporate both Western business models, making a profit while still reinvesting back into their community, into their youth, and building that foundation for generations to come. And I think that that's really what wealth looks like for Indigenous communities.
I love that. And I really appreciate being able to see and experience a lot of the tradition that has been brought forth from the Indigenous communities in the work that we're doing. And I agree that no repackaging could ever take that away. Thanks, Kristen. Shadi, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, and thanks, Kristen. I agree with everything Kristen just said. Yeah, really great to hear all those points. Just building on it a little bit, I think when I think about what we need for Indigenous communities to be empowered, I think about what empowered settler communities to build wealth on our lands. What were the tools that they were given to build wealth on our lands? And those tools were land and resources and free capital. That's what settler society utilized to build this country. And for Indigenous communities to be able to build our communities and rebuild our communities, we need access to land, we need access to our resources, and we need access to free capital, not borrowed capital. Those are the things that I think the barriers that existed historically. And so those are the things I think that we need to make available to our communities currently. And there's different mechanisms by which government and the private sector can support us in doing that. But really, I think it requires a transformational shift in this country to think about um, Indigenous people as self-determined, Indigenous nations as self-determined entities in this country, and not everything that is necessarily good for us may be good for Canada, and not everything that's good for Canada may necessarily be good for us. And we've seen that historically, and so we need to be able to have that conversation as well, and be open about having that conversation in this country. That a strong Canada does not always equate to strong Indigenous nations, and we've seen that historically. And so we need to think about what that means and what the relationship between this country and our nations is. And so ultimately, really breaking down those barriers, making sure that our communities have access to the same type of capital that made everyone else in this country rich and wealthy, that we can go beyond the confines of our community and access lands within our territories for free. A lot of the positioning right now is that we have to buy back our own land, convert it into reserve status to be able to utilize in different ways, or buying it back into fee simple. Like the system right now is not really set up for us to benefit. Somebody else is still benefiting off of us trying to rebuild our communities. And so that's something to think about as well. Um, yeah, so I think those are the three things. I think we need to make land, capital, and resources available to our communities and to our community members, both on and off reserve, and out of our settlements and out of the northern communities as well.
Yep, that's huge. I totally agree with you, Shadi. MJ, what are your thoughts around the key strategies needed to empower underrepresented groups for wealth building opportunities?
Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks everyone for all that insightful comments. So, one piece when I think about this is, thinking of wealth versus income. So, income is, of course, more cash flow, and then wealth is around the point that was just mentioned by Shadi around do you ownership, right? Ownership of real estate, ownership of businesses, things like that. So, thinking about those two pieces, and maybe I'll just mention I have limited experience on the wealth side. I'll talk a bit about the income side, but on wealth side, I see folks from Social Capital Partner are here on the call. They are doing some work on business ownership and transitions, or in the US, Apis has done work, or WS Marima Sifa. So there are a few folks that have done great work in Canada and otherwise. I'll talk a bit about more on the side where I have experience, more on the income side. So just a reminder about thinking about wealth and income, with the caveat that my experience is more on the income side. I would say a few things come to mind. Maybe I'll start with my own experience as an immigrant. Like you know what was just mentioned. To assist people in being the best version of themselves, you need access to opportunity, access to capital. So one is a philosophical piece that I remember. I'm an engineer from one of the top schools in India. I worked in oil and gas. I worked in microfinance. I moved to Canada, get my MBA, and then I was told that, hey, you need Canadian experience. How will I get Canadian experience when I haven't lived in Canada? And that still happens. So what I'm getting to is and this is especially pertinent for Canada because Canada continues to attract immigrants. So thinking, what I'm getting to is how people think of hiring. And I am only speaking the immigrant story because that's the experience I have. So that comes to one piece. And then the other would be supporting bold. So thinking in our own roles, right? Like how we are supporting people. And so that's one. The other would be supporting interesting, bold new ideas, such as windmill microlending, which provides loans to newcomers to Canada, or Raven Indigenous Impact Fund, which has provided financing to Indigenous entrepreneurs. If I just think, and sometimes when you're thinking of these specific deals, and I have invested in many of them many times through my various hats in the past, thinking about risk versus perception of risk. So that's another technical and philosophical piece that often, folks are used to that this is what a perception of risk ends up bringing the deal down so much more than the actual risk. If you look at Windmill, their default rates are lower than Canadian banks. And how are you evaluating it? How are you evaluating your due diligence, right? Another way of approaching how you're doing underwriting. So that would be another piece. And so that's what I believe, that thinking about wealth versus income. Wealth, I mentioned a few examples. In income, thinking about access to capital, access to opportunity that we just discussed, mentioning about how we can support people in their transitions, and supporting new bold ideas, thinking about risk and perception of risk, and how do you do underwriting, how do you actually evaluate deals, and being as objective, and all those kind of work. So i'll uh, I'll leave it at that. And maybe final comment would be, when I've invested in things like the Windmills or Ravens or BKR Capital, which is previously Black Innovation Capital, I've always said that this is not just about social impact. It's also about, you are tapping an untapped market. So it has the social and financial, both lenses to it. So those that would I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks, MJ. And Audrey, what are your
Thanks.
thoughts?
It's a great conversation, and I might take us to a bit of a different place, because part of what we see at the university is sort of the other end of the funnel. We see young people coming into school to learn and to grow. And part of what we try and do through business education is we have an entrepreneurship center here. And one of the ways that we're looking at changing things is that we're beginning to build in different kinds of ideas in terms of teaching students about what ownership and why it matters, and different models of ownership. So we've really prioritized working with women entrepreneurs, racialized communities, and collaborating with Indigenous partners across campus in terms of building out what it means to actually shape and grow a business within this economy. And what's been really interesting, because we have a portal as a university to the outside world through this entrepreneurship center, is the opportunities we have to bring in mentors to support students, and the generosity of time people offer if they're business owners or have learned about it. And then also we look a lot at pathways for communities. And because we're the University of Guelph, we work a lot with smaller and rural communities. And I think a lot of us have been watching the trends of newcomer settlement in smaller communities as well. So we're also beginning to look at, how do we help activate rural economies, and how do we work with newcomer communities in rural areas? So it's a bit of a different lens, but part of where my thinking's gone over the last few years, and my parents are both immigrants to this country and settlers in this country. And I think a lot about equity and access and knowledge, and how do we actually start building knowledge amongst young people in terms of how do they participate in the ownership economy, and how do they then start shaping and building communities through the skills that they learn through higher education. So that's the lens we've been taking, and really challenging ourselves. And one of the things we're just about to launch is to bring in an entrepreneur in residence, and somebody with a bit of a background in social entrepreneurship, just to teach students that there are different models. What's the co-op model? How do we look at worker-owned enterprises? What are the opportunities to actually create a nonprofit? And I think for students, especially business students, it's a real wake up to realize that there are different ways of structuring a business at the outset. So we're looking at providing some of those skills to students at that end, so that then when they go out, they can help start to build that economy. So we're looking at a very grassroots approach to that.
Yeah, that's very important, Audrey. And maybe I can throw it back to you for this question, because you mentioned some of the things that can be done. I'm wondering, how do you think these things will help to change the economic development landscape over the next 5 years?
I love that question. I think about that all the time. So I work a lot with economic developers across the country, and here are sort of my editorial comments on it. I think we're at a moment where we need ideas, right? So we need people with like practical, real ideas to help influence economic developers. They're great people. They're trying to do good work and build their economies. I find there's often a deficit in terms of models that are out there. So where my thinking has gone, because I used to work in that area and do a lot around downtown revitalization in cities, I think about the opportunities we have in two ways. One is to organize. And I can't say that enough in terms of organizing. I think what I've seen is that very often people go, okay, how does economic development happen? And there's a lot of sort of like, I think it's over here or maybe here. I think the reality is we as community members in our various communities, and I love the comments around ecosystem, we all can build network. And very often you can create a parallel structure, and you can just do that by calling a meeting with some friends and having a coffee or having a conversation. And I think because there's such a deficit of new ideas within that sort of more static field of economic development. And I'm not trying to be critical, I'm trying to be supportive and say we need to transform that. This idea of community wealth building is really about connecting some of the one-off initiatives. That's the language the Democracy Collaborative uses, connecting them and then scaling them in a way that's really meaningful so that it has greater impact. So it actually starts to democratize the economy. It starts to change ownership structures. It starts to shift power toward community ownership of assets and local flows of capital that actually keep money circulating and benefiting people in community, as opposed to having it be highly extractive and leaving community. So I think those are some of the ways I often talk with mayors and city councilors, and I challenge them to be like, come on, you want to be a first mover in this space and start embedding principles of community wealth building into the work you do. So lots to think about in that space.
Thanks, Audrey. Louise Edgar, I saw that you were supporting some of the things that Audrey was saying. So wondering, what do you think the community economic development landscape will change in the next 5 years?
Well, I think it has changed. And what I loved about what Audrey mentioned is it relates to the ecosystemic approach that I mentioned earlier, right? To make sure that, it's not a matter of one type of industry that focuses on the economic development part, that it's several industries coming together with different expertise and different way of and different ideas. So I think in terms of empowering and making sure that, we have a landscape in the future that kind of is still in the growing phase. I mentioned in the last few years, right, different initiatives. I remember back in 2010, we were mentioning, issues that relates to ethnocultural diversity, black BIPOC issues, and what were said to us is that we were exaggerating, right? And what's amazing to see is that in the last 10 years, there was an evolution in terms of, a better conscience about the issues that were lived on a day-to-day basis by these underprivileged or underprivileged communities. So we come to a point today where there was amazing improvements by putting together different measures, and when I say measures, specific measures to be able to address some of the issues of these communities. We talked about earlier, there was mentioned what relates to funding, right? We talked about barriers to access to capital, but it was important to kind of address this issue by putting together a source of capital that will be able to be more easily accessible by, for example, the Black community, by the indigenous community. I know it was mentioned earlier by MJ, I think, BKR Capital, that actually is currently providing support to Black businesses that are ready to scale, right? So I think the evolution continues. The only thing that I see is that currently, I mentioned some of the important resources to be able to empower these communities were put together in the last 5 years. We're coming to a point where they went through different programs that are set to expire soon. Um, if those programs were to expire or to disappear, then it will bring to a halt, I would say, or a slower pace, the evolution that we've had to support these communities. So it's important to continue to bring resources to kind of continue that work and continue that growth and this systemic change that we're been working on for the last, I would say 10 years. So the way I see the future up to a certain point seems bright, but we need to be intentional in making sure that it is bright by making sure that, whether there's resources, whether these different sectors, whether there's conscience about the day-to-day issues that are lived by these communities are considered, and that we're intentional in terms of continuing addressing them on a long-term basis to bring them to a point where it's self-sustainable. So that's what I would say about the landscape, the future landscape.
Absolutely. Self-sustainability is essential for our communities. MJ, what do you think about what's happening over the next 5 years?
A few things come to mind. Again, my work has primarily been on the investor side of things. And 6, 7 years back, when we did a few deals through one of my previous roles, investing in place-based funds across Canada, there weren't a lot of other investors doing that. And what I've observed in the last few years that a lot more folks have started looking outside just the traditional, the bigger hubs like the Torontos and Calgarys and Montreals and Ottawas. So I would say, uh, and again, purely from the investor standpoint, purely from the foundation side, which is, as I mentioned, was my previous background. So I would say more folks are looking beyond these places. They are looking at, local leadership. So that's exciting. And then there is also, more understanding. So someone said to me long back is everyone wants investment ready deals. No one wants to work on the pipeline. So folks are also putting capital through grants and otherwise to help build the ecosystem, help build the pipeline. So I am excited for these two reasons that folks have started looking beyond, are putting money on building capacity, and there would be some policy work needed on enabling policies. That's again not my background, so I can't comment much on that. But the closest example would be the community development finance institution work in the US. I've done a few deals in the US, and that has really encouraged banks as well as other players and spread of capital and things like that. So I know there are folks working on it, and just two examples just to make this concrete would be, and I see folks from Definity Foundation here. As I said, I'm on the board and on the investment committee, and I led a lot of our work before Wayne Miranda joined our team. And Definity has invested in a few place-based funds. Definity also has taken social finance impact investing as a focus area for itself, in which it's providing granting to build place-based funds. I see Geraldine from Catalyst, and I was with Catalyst before, which convenes all these place-based funds. So I would say, to sum it up, more folks, investors are looking outside. They are putting investment and grant capital for capacity building. And folks like Catalyst and Definity are both providing money, but also helping bringing the convening together, so that it's not you just standing by yourself. You are able to, someone said, I think in the beginning, right, like bringing community together, so you can leverage the power of community and get more things done, but also don't have to reinvent and reimagine things when it doesn't need to be done. So I am
Right.
excited, and have seen last few years have been very optimistic. Hopefully the pace is faster for the next 5 years. That's all.
Yep, we hope so. Thanks, MJ. Shadi, how do you see the next couple of years going?
I think there's some developments happening in the indigenous world that are quite significant. I don't know if they're going to keep going with the new government, but there's been significant amounts of dollars transferred from the federal government to First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities in the form of settlements over the last couple of years that has resulted in a pretty significant influx of capital, of cash, into, I'll speak specifically from a First Nation perspective, into some of our First Nation communities, whether through land settlements. I mean, the Robinson Huron settlement is a great example. We're talking billions of dollars that was transferred to First Nation communities as a part of a treaty settlement. And you have individuals in communities that got one-time settlement payments, some of upwards of $300,000-400,000. And there's an opportunity for our communities now to be able to transform that capital into long-term generational wealth for ourselves, for our families, for our communities. Um, I'm concerned though that may not happen. In the same way that when settlers came and took our lands and got capital to utilize our lands and create agricultural products and purchase lots for themselves and their families, that we're not taking advantage of those opportunities as well ourselves by reinvesting into land, reinvesting into opportunities that will create generational wealth for not just ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren going forward. And so, and I don't think you've asked this question yet, but I know it was in the questions that was sent about financial literacy. But there's significant opportunities to work with Indigenous communities, both on and off reserve, to help build that financial literacy to make sure that when our communities are resolving these types of claims, they're getting access outside of business development opportunities, but people are just getting access to capital that we never had before. And being able to think about and think through how we want to utilize that capital in ways that are in line with our values as a people, that are in line with our worldview, but also contribute to not having to worry as much as we worried over the past about, making ends meet in our communities. And so, just thinking through those and just thinking about how the non-Indigenous community can support our communities in developing that work and developing that literacy as well, I think will be really important. And again, I'm not sure, with it with a new government coming in that might be a little bit more um, on the fighting side of litigation when it comes to a lot of these settlements. We might not see as much of this capital flowing into our communities, but I can't say. But I mean, right now we are in a historic moment where we're seeing funds transferred to our communities that like never before. And I don't hear people talking about it as much in the non-Indigenous world when we're talking about access to capital, when we're talking about land back and cash back to communities. It is happening in some ways, in some places, in very substantial ways. Um, but I think I would say from my own community perspective, we had settled a claim ourselves, and every community member received what could, in essence, have been utilized like a micro grant to develop a small business or develop or to invest in long-term investments within our community. And I didn't do that. I was 18 years old, and they dropped a bunch of money off into my bank account, and I didn't know what to do with it. And so I think about that for other people in our communities as well that might be getting those types of funds. My daughter, when she turns 18, will be getting her settlement money for lands that were taken from us. And I'm thinking already like, how do I make sure that it just doesn't vanish from our communities and leave our communities and go into somebody else's hands and make somebody else wealthy? So these are things I think we need to be thinking about internally as Indigenous communities, but also externally. If you're looking at ways to engage with Indigenous communities, this is a way. I know that there's a lot of when I worked with the investment readiness program, there's a lot of people and organizations within this ecosystem that exist to support other organizations. But also, I think thinking about how can we support individuals as well within community and trying to figure out how to best manage their wealth will be important
Right.
going.
Yep. Thanks, Shadi. And Kristen, how do you see the next 5 years going?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what everyone has already said, and I can build off a few. I was writing some notes as others were speaking, and I think I'll start by saying I think a big opportunity is what Shadi was saying is moving the settlement dollars and the wealth that Indigenous people already have into community investment. And my personal research is that most of that money is not going back into community investments. It's either being spent or being invested in the capital markets, and which we know is not, you're only getting the financial gains if you're lucky. So I think that there's a huge opportunity to move some of that wealth into more community development opportunities. And that can be done by impact investing. It can be done in First Nations and Indigenous governments making those investments themselves. When my nation was doing our community outreach on our treaty settlements, my first question is, are we getting a direct distribution? And thankfully, they are not, because I think that the direct distributions right now today can be very harmful for Indigenous communities. There's many statistics that it leads to horrible things in our community. So I think that there's a big opportunity for shared learning as well. And I think that it is changing, in groups like Catalyst and Boston Impact Initiative down in the US are doing amazing work at building that community of network. And learning from each other. My friends down in the Southwest in New Mexico are starting an impact fund for Indigenous women. And we're shared learning all the time of what's working, how can we continue doing this work. Another amazing organization is Indian Collective that's very focused on intergenerational wealth building and change making in Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. And yeah, I think that the next 5 years, I'm pretty optimistic. that things are moving in the right direction. And I think that I hope to see that with any government changes that we might see. So trying not to be worried.
Absolutely. I agree. I agree that, regardless of the government, we all recognize the support that's required for Indigenous communities and all diverse communities in their own way. So, and I'm hearing a theme here that, one of the ways that change can happen is through community support, and that's through supporting others' initiatives, even if, that doesn't directly impact us as individuals. And so, I wonder what are some of the other big challenges or obstacles and perhaps some of the action steps that can help to rectify some of these things that are coming in our way. Let's start with you, MJ.
Um, Thanks, Julissa. So maybe obstacle action steps I'll go back to, and my comments could sometimes be, dry. I'm a engineer and finance guy, so sometimes, it's more tactical. But what I've observed is one would be, providing financing, right? Like for capacity building or any of that work. I was at some conference and someone mentioned that you can't give someone $30,000 for like a specific project for with like a 6-month mandate and expect them to change the world. So having in philanthropy again, through some of the board roles I've sat on, I've heard a lot about for the last few years on trust-based philanthropy. And so I think providing capital and financing that's long term, that supports capacity building, that would be one key element. Other, I would say, would be thinking of investments, going from my investment hat, thinking of investment underwriting due diligence differently. An example I'll just say is, if you're looking at an offering like Windmill that does not have a Standard and Poor's or Moody's rating, that's rate. I mean, those cost a lot of money, and those are mostly done for like large scale transactions. Does it make it any less? Should you not evaluate the fundamentals of what the business is? And so, understanding that social impact, creating social impact does not necessarily mean that you're leaving returns on the table. And so, yeah, those would be my few comments that a broader maybe I'll actually step back in the philanthropic side. A broader pool of decision makers, having a broader pool of decision maker, more people with some lived experience, more people who do not come only for finance. Even though I come from finance, I would still say more people who come from broader perspective. I've always so that would be one, providing long-term capacity building support. Um, Multi-year, ideally, and I gave a few examples. And then when it comes to underwriting, thinking of investments, underwriting differently, thinking of risk and perception of risk differently. And that's what I would leave it at. So that's some of the obstacles I've seen,
Yeah.
and that's would be my suggestions on my thoughts on what can help things moving forward. And I'm just thinking of the deals we have done, right? Like I'll just pick up Raven. Like I was CFO for a foundation in Toronto. We were one of the first few invested within like $1 or $2 million. And my point was, nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? If you want to change the world or do something, you have to take a bet. You have to go ahead. You have to do your job. But
Right.
after a certain point, you have to be bold. If you want to make change, you have to be bold. You have to act and you have to do things. So the final comment would be, talk less, do more. I'll
I
leave it at
love
that.
it. Thanks, MJ. What are some of your thoughts on this, Audrey? Like, what are the biggest challenges and some actions that can go against them?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a big question. We did a multi-city case study where we asked this question to a number of organizations across the province because we wanted to understand the barriers to community wealth building. And, some of them are easy to see and some of them are much more complicated. But MJ, I think you're on it in the sense that it's a bold step and it's a change. So I think what we learned is that anytime there's a change, there's always power, traditionally held, if I can use that term, kind of power. And there's always a fear of risk associated with that. So I think part of what the barriers are just the opportunity for different ways of thinking. And that goes to governance of some of the organizations that are very close to us, right? The members that sit on that board, the knowledge they bring and their tolerance for new ways of doing things. So, challenging traditional power structures is always one of the key barriers. I think the other part of it is also we talked about sort of this idea of supply and demand demand, right? It's also building up, organizing to build that supply in the market. What are the opportunities for investment? How are they communicated? How do we look at attracting investors? So we've just launched a national project, and two of my research partners are on the call, Heather Hashigian and Tessa Hebb, and we're looking at sort of how do we build the community bond market in Canada. So we're going to be asking those questions through a national survey we're about to launch, because we know that capital flows are really, really important, and we want to try to find ways to anchor it in community and to remove some of those barriers. So we're just about to launch a big study exploring that. So it's a complex one. And I'll just say one last thing. I think there's a huge responsibility amongst anchor institutions in our communities to take a leadership role in this space. So when you look at everything from a municipal government to higher education institutions, even to our hospitals and community foundations, to begin to take a lead, because very often those anchors set the tone in community for what opportunities are out there, and they can really help mainstream what is perceived to be kind of a fringe impact investment market. So those are a couple of ideas.
Thanks, Audrey. I really appreciate those insights. Shadi, what are your thoughts around some of the obstacles and the best ways forward?
Yeah, I think that I mean, there's always going to be this push and this drive to just maintain the status quo of the dominant power in this country. And I think as Indigenous people, we know that all too well. And to be able to push back that there are alternative ways, I'm not even going to say alternative. There are Indigenous ways of thinking and ways of knowing and ways of being that are fundamentally different and opposed to Western understandings of the world and ideologies and of wealth and of capital and of resources and of land. And we need to make sure that those perspectives and ideologies are platformed, are heard from, are listened to. I believe, oftentimes within the economic sphere, also within the governance sphere, there's Indigenous communities are complex and diverse, and there are different perspectives within our communities on these subjects. I think oftentimes we hear a lot from the voices and perspectives of individuals who are playing the game and are okay to play the game and want to play the game, but we don't often hear the voices and perspectives of individuals who hold a different opinion on these subjects and on these topics. And so I think we really need to make sure that those voices are also platformed, so that individuals, settlers, Canadians can actually hear from Indigenous peoples that view their governance structures, their economic systems, their community systems as independent and autonomous systems that operate not alongside Canada, but in opposition to. And that's something that we need to acknowledge exists in this country. There is something that exists that does not necessarily want to be a part of this whole system, that wants to liberate ourselves from it, to implement our own economic systems, to implement our own governance structures, to implement our own land management systems. And that's something that still exists in this country. And so I think we need to make sure that it's heard and that it's engaged with. And so, I guess that's just what I would say is that the obstacle for me is that I still see that there is a push to assimilate Indigenous people into the dominant paradigm that settler colonization has tried to accomplish over the last at least since Canada has been formed, but prior to that as well.
Thanks, Shadi. You definitely bring a unique perspective that's very important here. I wonder what you have to add, Kristen.
Oh my gosh, that was great. That's exactly what I would have said. But I guess I don't even know if I have anything to add, but exactly. I think Indigenous people need the power to create our own solutions, have our sovereignty. And I think that like well-being is not only just community, but it's like individual well-being, organizational well-being, which then creates community well-being, and how those three work together. So I think when I'm thinking of an obstacle of that, I think it's really the obstacle is like, how can we make this all work together? And when I think of in a financial sense. I think that for Indigenous people, we really need to focus on financial healing. Um, Many Indigenous people have complex relationships with money. That's through intergenerational trauma, historical economic exclusion, and deep mistrust for financial institutions. So I think that's a big barrier that's holding Indigenous people back from creating that long-term wealth. And I think that we must recognize that financial empowerment starts with healing. Um, and how can we build on that? So that's some of the work that we're trying to integrate into our work as we're providing capital to Indigenous entrepreneurs and starting with that healing aspect around money, and then moving beyond, I guess, Western financial concepts, and realigning to what traditional Indigenous economies have always been built on, which is reciprocity, communal wealth, and land stewardship. So bringing those aspects into our work, and really grounding ourselves in that, is how we're trying to overcome that barrier at Entrepreneur.
Perfect. And I agree that, that healing is so important. And it's really important that we also lean on Indigenous Canadian and Indigenous African practices and, just tap into our ancestral knowledge in all ways as we figure out how to do this. Louise Edgar, wondering what you think on this topic.
Well, actually, my point is going to touch a little bit about the landscape, right? I think it was mentioned by some of my colleagues. The landscape currently is changing. As you know, not only considering the political element of things, but as well the on the private sector, they're starting to remove actually DEI, structures into corporate entities. Um, I think it's important to keep staying intentional. I think what worked in the last few years in terms of, putting on the forefront the issues that were lived by people from ethnocultural diversity, BIPOC communities is the fact that, there was access issues, as I mentioned earlier. And the way to address the access issues is first go through sensibilization, but make sure that we intentionally create a space to these communities in the different corporate entities or in different entities, period. Um, it worked. Now, because of the kind of change in landscape right now, there's more a sense where, these initiative and intentional initiatives are being removed. I think we have to make sure that we still, there's kind of a step back that is currently being taken, but we have to make sure that we continue to strengthen the message that it's important to keep, in order to address these access issues, to keep actually pushing for BIPOC communities to integrate actually the different systems and different corporate entities, the public sectors, different sectors all around. So, in order to do that, I feel that it's important to understand that, when we talk about BIPOC communities, it's not charity, right? It's value. BIPOC communities actually bring value here in Canada to the Canadian society, but to the world society, right? So at the end of the day, how can we show that, these communities bring values? I touched a little bit earlier about some of the statistics and the data that relates to the Black Entrepreneurship Program, for example, or the Supporting Black Canadian Community Initiative. Not to sound redundant, but it's more than 7,000 jobs that were created through that program. So the Black community brought value. There's again, $420 million of revenue generated through Black initiatives across the country. That again is value. We talk about building capacity for non-for-profit organization. More than 20,000 volunteers were added to those non-for-profit organizations. Again, that is adding value. And when we talk about adding value through the Black community, the Canadian Black community, at the end, what we're doing is we're adding value to Canada as a whole. So that's actually the message that we need to give and make sure that the different decision maker understands is that BIPOC communities bring value to the Canadian community. And that's how we'll be able to kind of, um, I wouldn't call it, yeah, it's an obstacle, yes, but it's kind of a challenge that we need to to go through, right? So that's what I would bring to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa Gard, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think that was the perfect way to wrap up the conversation. We always want to end the session in the same way that we began by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We also acknowledge our ancestors. We acknowledge all of those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all of the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you again, panelists.